In some cultures, the food on the table not only appeals to the palate, but also carries traces of the past. While Chinese cuisine is notable for its diversity and unusual ingredients, the origins of these habits are not just a matter of preference. Painful periods buried in the dark pages of history have pushed people to their limits in order to survive. Many foods that seem strange to us today were once synonymous with survival. But can we really understand this story? Is it possible for someone who has not been tested by hunger to grasp what desperation can become? Welcome to Mirror of Babylon. By the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had expanded its borders to their widest point and ruled over a population of about 30 million people. While this may seem like an enormous figure for that time, China's population in the same period was almost 4 times that, about 130 million. No matter what period of history you look at, China has always been one of the most populous regions in the world. And this has been the case despite major disasters such as wars, famines, and epidemics. So what was the reason behind this huge population? China's vast territory, fertile valleys, and variable climate have always made agriculture a vital element. Fertile soils have ensured continuous food production, and the population has always grown rapidly compared to neighboring civilizations. But a large population comes with serious risks as well as advantages. If managed well, it can become an immense power, but the slightest imbalance can lead to disaster. How has China managed this balance over thousands of years? The answer is simple but brutal: food control and stern authority. People, especially in rural areas, were often seen as production machines. The state set production quotas for peasants and severely punished those who failed to meet these targets. If they failed to grow the required amount of crops, their right to food was either restricted or they were directly punished. As a result, people were forced to work hard to avoid starvation. For centuries, this method was used as a tool to force the population to obey. But the question may come to your mind: why didn't people revolt against such a harsh government? And here lies the interesting point. Mao Zedong was one of the most power-obsessed leaders in history and one of the most striking examples of what can happen when such an ego is given absolute power. In 1921, during the Chinese Civil War, he became the head of the communist movement, increasing his political power. And in 1949, with the communist victory, he established the People's Republic of China and became the absolute ruler of the country until his death. In 1958, the Great Leap Forward began, one of Mao's most ambitious projects. Ostensibly aimed at creating a modern industrialized China, in reality it was a disaster for millions of people. Mao's vision was to completely reshape rural life, creating giant industrial centers and collective agricultural communes. People working in these communes were forced to live in factories, their entire lives devoted to production. Payments were mostly in the form of food, only enough to keep them alive. Those who refused to work were either exiled or faced a much worse fate. To feed this massive labor force, agricultural production was equally rigidly regulated. Farmers on state-controlled collective farms were forced into superhuman production quotas. For Mao, the people had only one goal: to produce more industry and more food. Human life, labor, and individual freedom were of no value. All that mattered was the building of the new China he envisioned. In 1966, Mao launched the so-called Cultural Revolution, this time aiming to control not only the body, but also the mind of the people. By waging war on China's thousands of years of history, traditions, and philosophy, he wanted to sever the people's ties with their past. So much so that China, one of the oldest and most impressive civilizations of mankind, began to destroy its own identity under the pretext of modernization. In this process, everything that bore traces of the past was seen as a threat. Traditional artisans, handicraftsmen, those who preserved historical artifacts, even people with old books on their shelves, became victims of a brutal process. They were sent to concentration camps, subjected to forced labor and severe torture. Artisans had their hands cut off. Believers in philosophical and religious teachings were massacred. Temples were destroyed, and sacred texts burned to erase traces of Confucianism. It was as if the memory of a nation was being erased and the thinking of the people was being eliminated. Repression escalated, production quotas reached unimaginable levels, and society was on the brink of collapse. But this collapse was triggered not by a public revolt saying, "Enough is enough," but by a much more unexpected event. The final straw for the Chinese people came not from human hands, but from a tiny bird species: sparrows. In 1958, at a time when Mao considered himself a god, China's ruling team made a simple observation. They noticed that small sparrows were eating grain that had fallen on the ground. Based on this observation, they make a very simple deduction. Sparrows eat grain. Then these birds will eat the grain in the fields, and we will not be able to reach our production targets. With this thought, events quickly unfolded. An order known as the Mao birds is sent out across the country, ordering the killing of all the sparrows in the country. At first glance, it seems a ridiculous decision, but the order is carried out with great fervor by the population. Tens of millions of sparrows are slaughtered, and this barbaric slaughter is celebrated as a great victory. But no one is aware that this horrible massacre will lead to an even greater catastrophe in the future. Although the first harvest shows a slight increase, Mao and his team take comfort in the knowledge that this increase will continue. But then, unexpectedly, something straight out of the Bible or the Torah begins: an endless invasion of locusts and insects. This is a major blow not only to the crops but also to Mao's plans. As birds, the natural predators of insects, are decimated across the country, the insect population begins to grow uncontrollably. This leads to an explosion in the number of other creatures in their food chain, especially rats. The rats follow the insect increase and attack all food stocks in the fields and warehouses, consuming and destroying everything. China desperately tried to import millions of sparrows from neighboring Russia, but it was too late. As the agricultural production system collapsed, the disintegration of the food chain hit millions of industrial workers like a tsunami. This chain of disasters turned China, then home to some 800 million people, into a living hell. As the food crisis deepened, Mao's regime began to ignore the rural population. Staple food exports, especially from Russia, peaked in order to keep industry afloat. But this food was distributed primarily to maintain order in the cities. As we all know, many governments prioritize their power and ideals over protecting their people. So in difficult times, it is often the low-income people who are the first to be eliminated. The Chinese government has made them the first target by almost completely cutting off food aid to village communes that failed to meet production quotas. What happened next was truly terrible. The hunger was so severe that people started to consume the living creatures in the area where they lived. In time, livestock and wildlife completely collapsed. This consumption was not a matter of hunting, cleaning, cooking, and preparing food. Millions of people were struggling to survive. According to survivors, during this 3-year period of horror, people tore up and ate every living thing in nature as soon as they found it, like wild animals, because wasting time preparing food meant that others would take it over. And worst of all, what happened when animal resources were completely depleted? Humans took turns eating insects, grass, weeds, bark, and even mud. This desperate and brutal situation is remembered as one of the darkest days in human history. I'm sure you're all heartbroken right now, but things haven't even reached their peak yet. In a documentary broadcast years ago, a woman who owed her survival to her mother said in an interview, "I was a little girl then. Our village had long since run out of food, and all my bones were being counted. I didn't even have the strength to stand up. It had been a few months since I lost my father to starvation. When he lost consciousness and collapsed, people cut him up, boiled him, and ate him. We were used to this scene because it had happened so many times before. We had to eat dead people to survive, and when there was no food left, people ate the dead in the grave. When my mother could no longer fight hunger, she closed the door to our house, sat me in front of her, and put a knife next to me. She told me, 'When I die, I want you to eat me before the others come. My daughter, eat as much as you can.' I couldn't even listen to him because I was crying, and really soon he collapsed and died on the spot. It took me a while to realize this truth, but I knew that people would come to our door, and I tore off pieces of my mother's exposed legs and ate as much as I could. Soon after, the neighbors who couldn't see her broke down our door, broke in and ate her in front of my eyes. It was not only our families that Mao took from us, he also took our humanity from us. The details of many more similar incidents are written in detail by Yang Zhisheng in his book Tombstone. You can get it and read it if you want. The details of the famine, the catastrophe, and the losses during this period are truly moving. The extinction of animals, plants, insects, and the incredible starvation among people reveal a chilling reality. This catastrophe during Mao's reign was devastating for the Chinese people. However, the survival of Mao and the Communist Party can be understood as an indication of the structural strength of Chinese society and the loyalty to the party. China's leadership remains strong even after a major social and economic upheaval. Even today, the party Mao founded remains at the helm of China, and its legacy continues to profoundly influence the social and political structure of the country. I think now you know the answer to the question, why do the Chinese eat everything? The generations who had to survive by eating mud in those years grew up to perceive everything as food. This trauma of starvation was passed down from generation to generation. In fact, traces of it still remain. Today, as the consumption of insects, cats, dogs, or exotic animals is declining in China, remember the critical point I made in the video. A large population is like a time bomb that will explode over time. From 2020 onwards, changing climatic conditions and rising demand began to leave China's food production now below supply. Massive water shortages, especially in 2022 and 2023, led to a massive decline in agricultural yields. According to a report published in 2024, the drought of the last 2 years will indirectly affect 900 million people in the coming years. Given the country's population of 1.4 billion, this is an extremely serious figure. But will China be able to overcome this problem? I don't think so. The drought in 2022 alone has affected 2.2 million hectares of land in agriculture. Intensive regions like Sichuan, Hebei, Hunan, and that's just to name a few. China has once again created this problem. Yes, this time, instead of killing the sparrows, it has embarked on a frenzied industrial expansion. As a result, rivers have either dried up completely or become severely polluted and no longer usable for agriculture. Nature always maintains its own balance. If you disturb it, you pay the price. So what do you think will happen this time? What will the 900 million people affected do if the climate deteriorates further and droughts increase in the coming years? Please share your ideas in the comments. Once again, we have learned one of the reasons why the Chinese view everything as food. Of course, there are historical and cultural factors, but this incident stands out as one of the biggest reasons. The question is, as the next famine knocks on China's door step by step, what or who else will this human community then start to look at as food?